Hello and welcome to the 75th episode of Neo Human Podcast. I'm Agah Bahari, a Dagologist on Twitter and Instagram. And you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, BitChute, and soon on Spotify, following the lead of Joe Rogan. And on this episode, I'm welcoming back Chris Nebar. And welcome back to Neo Human, Chris.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, man. It's like a different world since the last time that we spoke. And you came to my mind literally the first person when this corona thing happened. I'm like, I have to talk to Chris Nebar, and it took me about 10 episodes to get to you, but things happen as they happen. Let's start for those of our audience who are not familiar with you, with your background, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Yeah, those are some good questions. My research for the last 30 years has been in the left and right sides of the brain and how they differ. And that's an interesting field to be in these days because, on the one hand, the worst thing that could happen for a scientist is your ideas become popular. And as soon as they became popular, then everyone dismissed it. And so when I tell people I do left-right brain research, they're like, oh, I thought that whole thing was disproven. I'm like, well, no, it's more complex than that. But then along the whole way, I've been doing, the neuroscience led me up to a certain level of understanding. And I always felt that it was just part of the picture. So for the last 30 years, I've also been studying Buddhism, Zen, Taoism, Hindu philosophy. And to me, they made a very nice match. I found it pretty easy to kind of weave the two together into kind of a philosophy or a kind of system. And that's what I've been working on. That's what I'm working on my second book here. And the second book is really going to be about consciousness and the main problem in consciousness research and how, particularly in the West, we confuse the thinking mind, which is a great tool. And it's the thing that's allowing us to kind of converse right now. But we confuse the thinking mind with the essence of consciousness. And I think when we make that mistake, it takes us down a really weird trip. And that's the problem. We have so many brilliant people doing consciousness research right now, and that their biggest drawback is they're brilliant. And it's their brilliant thinking mind that occupies so many of these different little puzzles. And it's the thing about life and the thinking mind. It's like this endless onion that it has, layer after, and it just keeps going on. And so the thinking mind never finds any rest. And so it's nice to take a break. And I like to think that maybe Monday through Thursday, I'm a kind of a scientist. I don't know how I slipped that in now because now Friday became part of the weekend. But then Friday through, Sunday, I'm a Buddhist. I'm a Taoist, and I practice meditation, and I practice not thinking. And so I put the thinking mind aside on the weekends to the best that I can. Sometimes it's a struggle. The thinking mind is so convinced that there are so many problems out there, and the thinking mind searches for a problem. And if it can't find one, it will make one up.
Yeah.
And so the weekends, it's interesting.
It's also interesting that not only you come up with problems that make it seem so real, once you solve that problem, it changes the goalposts. Like, yes. That was not it, it was just part of it.
That wasn't the real problem. Now we're doing, and it goes on. And it just never, and that's the thing, the thinking mind keeps believing, if I just have this much money in the bank, if I just have this, if this will happen, then I can finally start living. And we're figuring out like that's just never happens. And then you end up, you're, in your 50s, you're old, and then all of a sudden you're like, what happened to my life? Oh, I spent my life thinking. I spent my life thinking, creating problems, and every time I solved one, another one came on the scene. And so, and that's, and we're kind of experiencing that really firsthand here. It's funny you said how much has changed, and it's absolutely true on some level. Like the whole world is different, and then on some other level, no, it's the same exact world. Everything's exactly the same. I'm sitting here in the same office. I go for the same walk, but on another level, it absolutely seems different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started talking to people when this whole thing begun, focused on why this also can be an opportunity for us to realize that a lot of things that we have relied on, it's not that they've been disrupted. It's just that all of them have been basically illusions and delusions and stuff that we have made up for ourselves and took him seriously. And now that something it's very organic that it's happening and targeting our very survival. Now we're realizing, oh, we can't rely on government. We can't rely on my degree. We can't rely on our jobs. And a lot of people are freaking out exactly because of that, it seems like.
It's put a crack in the illusion of social constructions.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, people go to jobs and then all of a sudden they're kind of like, my job isn't very real. It was just a place I went to and I did some stuff and then I came home. That's what jobs are. And now people are working from home and they're questioning, you know, it's been a very big shift in some of the fundamentals of the thinking mind. The thinking mind loves what it would call normalcy. It strives towards that. And we can't have it. It's saying, you know, no, the thinking mind was denied the very thing it seeks, which is just this kind of predictability. And now all of a sudden, and now we get no end state. I don't know how things are where you're at here in Pennsylvania. It's not quite the same all over the country, of course, but we still have no particular end state. And so the thinking mind could probably deal with quite a bit if it knew in some point if it could bring all these illusions back online. Mm-hmm. And it's like been this permanent kind of, we don't know when we can bring those back online. So they may be permanently, you know, jobs and some of our social roles. And like you mentioned, government. And now I've been doing a couple videos on the idea of what government even means and what would it mean if we didn't have government, and why, you know, and the idea of control and self-control. And that's one of the main things about the thinking mind. It's always this game of control. And then when you like I said, I try to give myself a break over the weekends and put the thinking mind away for a little bit. And what I realize is that the moments of levity and the moments of just beautiful consciousness are almost always when I put down this notion of control and this insistence that reality has to be some particular way. And then you pick up and you're like, this must be like this. And everything gets heavy again. And
then you build your expectations on that basis, which is a sandcastle to begin with.
Yeah. And it's just that wonderful, you know, game that we've been playing the game that we've been playing for a long time. It's like, you know, everyone's playing Monopoly and someone just came and hit the board and said, no, this is just a game. Yeah. And we're like, we're kind of like, no, we want it, like you mentioned, how we take things seriously. And that's something I've been pondering a lot over the last few months. In fact, theoretically, in terms of the left and right brain, if someone were to ask me, like, what's the real difference between the left and right sides of the brain, at least for right now, I would probably say the left brain takes the world terribly seriously, and the right brain just sees it as a play, a joke, a game, and it's not terribly serious about anything. And you can see that kind of attitude. And when you get serious, which again, we've kind of turned a lot on to the seriousness lately, you know, this must happen, this has to happen. And that just gets everyone, you know, what is it? It's just this kind of tense contraction of the muscles that people feel. And we're paying the price for it. You can see all over, like in the US, you can see the suicide rates, the addiction rates. I mean, everything is just kind of going through the roof because it's like we're a kid and, you know, we want our way and someone came along and said, you're not getting it.
Yeah.
And thinking mind has no clue what to do with that.
It's funny you're saying it. One of our relatives, she'll turn 70 in 2 or 3 days. In the beginning of all of this, we were like, hey, you have to take care of yourself, stay home, don't go out. And she wasn't taking it seriously whatsoever. She went to the casino, she went to a whole bunch of shopping mall, and all of a sudden, right now, she's not even allowing her husband to order pizza. You know, when she comes over, everybody should wear a mask. It's this, you know, this conviction that what you have in mind is the objective truth and objective reality. And because people don't agree with you, it just means that they're wrong and they have to be convinced how wrong they are. And all it produces, from my perspective, is just further and further anxiety and energy that is being wasted because you're achieving nothing. You're going against a far bigger reality that you're not even acknowledging its existence.
this notion, I try not to watch too much of the news, but I do at sometimes keep up on things because there's a certain need where you feel like, you don't want to be totally out of the loop on something this big. And I have yet to hear someone just come right out and say, look, we don't have a clue as to what's going on. We really don't know. Maybe this virus will wipe out the human race, or maybe it's absolutely nothing and it's trivial.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult for the thinking mind to deal with. The thinking mind would rather have a bad idea and feel conclusive about it, than to just admit, I don't know. And we don't know. We don't know what's going to, and we never know. I mean, that's the weird thing about this trip we call life. I mean, I've known people who have worried and kept them up all night over things, and then something else came along in their life and killed them, and they had no clue that that was waiting for them.
Yeah.
There's that old saying, you make plans and God laughs. And we're so sure our plans. Oh well, we need to do this or we need to do that. And where's the movement who's just admitting and embracing the idea that we just don't know? It's like Alan Watts, that wisdom of insecurity. There's a certain truth that we just, as much as the thinking mind wants to control nature, the problem with nature is it's an incredibly complex system. And complex systems are very difficult to predict. So when you talk about viruses alone, and then you add in the human element, that makes it even more unpredictable. Human beings are very difficult to predict. Maybe it's free will, or maybe it's just that you can predict us in groups. So the day after Thanksgiving, lots of people are going to go shopping. And you can predict certain things like that. But you can't predict which people. Like you were saying, some people had a certain attitude with this, and then all of a sudden everything flipped. And now they're like a different person. And that's the difficult thing about people. On an individual basis, we're really difficult to predict. I never know what I'm going to do. My wife will tell me. She's like, talking to you gives me whiplash because, you're talking about something one moment, and then you're off on some other, I don't know what you're going to say next.
My girlfriend had the same problem with me. I'm having fun though, like
that's I think that's the message we can take from this, is and of course, and people will say, well, life and death is on a line, and that's the game that, are we going to take that one seriously too? Yeah. I mean, what if it's all a game? And this comes up a lot with Alan Watts, and people will say, well, if he was so enlightened, why did he drink so much? He was a pretty bad alcoholic and probably died because of drinking related problems. But, then you wonder, I mean, if it really, what is the essence of the game? To live a really long life, or to have, maybe it should be shorter, but you had a lot of fun with it. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't dare to give any advice on any of these matters, except just to bring up different alternatives and, and enjoy, the different scenarios and play the game. And have a little bit of fun with it. Try to.
You mentioned Alan Watts. I think Alan Watts also said the problem is that we are taking seriously what gods have created for fun.
Yep, and that's put it all together.
Yeah,
we're taking seriously what should have been a joke, a grand cosmic joke that should keep us laughing, and we do have these experiences. Or something that we get really worried about, and we can feel the muscular tension, and and then all of a sudden you realize it was nothing, and then you laugh about it, and you're like, I can't believe I actually got sucked into thinking how serious that was. But then we can't seem to take that, like right now, this game that we're playing, and again, someone might get very offended. They'll say, "Oh, game! This isn't a game. This is serious." And I know, I understand that, but at the same time, on some kind of cosmic level. Can we take that message and live a life of play? Like kids. Kids are wonderful. And like Alan Watts said, it's like music is interesting because people play music, but they go to work, and that's the trick. Can we go to work, but really make it play? And it's been very difficult because we're at a very serious, you go out. And you venture out. I mean, venturing out to a local store becomes a very serious kind of thing, and mask wearing, the whole mask debate. I did a video on, should we be wearing masks? And it's a very, I mean, could you imagine like 10 years ago, someone saying, oh, by the way, there's going to be this kind of like war over whether you should wear a mask or not. I mean, you'd find it kind of like, no way. And I can't imagine people would take that. So, why?
Yeah.
And who knows how people will retrospectively look at this. And it's the same thing. No one knows really whether if I go out today with a mask on or if I go out without it. No one knows what the consequences are. The system is far too complex.
Yeah, and the idea that we can be protected 100% because all of a sudden we decided to wear masks, because this is a very different society. I'm in Florida, you're in Pennsylvania, but if you go to Japan, people have been wearing masks for decades in Japan. If you're sick, you wear a mask, but that has not much to do with you being shamed or forced to do it. This is like just an ethic thing, like nice thing. You're being a decent human being, not to wanting to spread your sickness to other people. Well, that's understandable, but to say that, hey, you're not allowed to live outside of your home if you're not wearing a mask, then you got to wonder what else is coming after that. That this whole narrative is based on fear. There is nothing else. Hey, be afraid of this. We're gonna put all of these restrictions and controls and everything, more and more aspects of your life, maybe so people can be even more predictable. What you said about group thinking, I'm thinking about, I don't care about birthdays. I'm offending people with that. I don't care about holidays. I'm offending people with that, but I cannot take it seriously. I don't understand what is the point of celebrating a day that is just a random day we came up with and something has happened, but people are taking it very seriously. But now that you're saying that, I'm thinking maybe those days and those events, they exist to begin with to predict people and sell them stuff and build upon that.
Well, that's the thing about the thinking mind. It figures out it's very difficult to control the thinking mind. And one of my favorite exercises is just a simple thing like don't think of the number 13, and sure enough, people will think of the number 13. And so the thinking mind is you realize it's difficult, if not impossible, to control. And that's what we deal with when we meditate. You're sitting there. I remember when I was in my 20s and I would try to meditate, and I thought if I could just control my mind. And today that seems so laughable. You can't control your mind.
Yeah, oxymoronic, yeah.
And so, and then you figure out you just let it kind of do its thing. But the mind seems like when it can't control itself, the first thing it does is start to control other minds. And it seems to find quite a bit of satisfaction with this. And I think I've kind of feel like a stranger in humanity with this. I don't, at least on the surface, I've never felt like I've gotten anything out of trying to control other minds. But as I observe other humans, that seems to be one of the things. It's one of our hobbies, It's like we want to control other minds, and I mean, and this whole debate seems to be like, what do I care what you do? Shouldn't I be a little more concerned with why I'm concerned with why am I concerned with what you're doing?
Exactly.
But that's that thing in our culture, we shifted over to the external, and instead of turning it inward. And I mean, that's quite a thing to ponder, I think, to walk away from and go, that dude, in the store wasn't wearing a mask, and man, that irritates me. Why does that irritate me? Well, what is it about me that really irritates me about that? Because, I mean, we could spin scenarios. I mean, the frontal lobe is wonderful at spinning, what ifs. Oh, well, if you didn't wear that mask, then there's this hypothetical possibility that this could have happened and this could have happened, that could have eventually, and we can spin scenarios like that, but we have no clue whether that's, those are accurate. And I mean, the core is like, really, what was it about this person doing this thing that set me off? And the more you investigate that stuff, man, you'll go on this trip, you'll find that it's all the stuff that bothers you. It literally it's a mirror shooting right back at you. Figuring out, maybe it's a shadow kind of thing. And like maybe you want to rip your mask off and go running through, and you're mad because you're wearing it. So that's what really makes you mad. And so, this has been an interesting time. And some people have pointed out the blessings and some of the real things that were, the kind of introspective moments that we can have. You're sitting at home. What are you going to do? Are you going to crack open that book of philosophy? Are you going to start pondering the big questions about life and like, what are you doing here? I started off with the question of consciousness, and I'm like, it's one of the strangest things, the all-time strangest things about consciousness is to most people, it doesn't seem strange. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm a conscious being, I have consciousness and I'm experiencing the world. And that just is like the most trivial thing. When if you just stumble on that, like, you should just go running through the streets going like, man, I'm a conscious being. This is the freakiest thing. It should terrify us and, send us on this amazing trip to just the fact that we're conscious. And somehow we have the ability to just trivialize it and just think it's ordinary. And we're more worried about someone having a mask on than, contemplating the fact that I'm a conscious entity in this universe. And what's my connection with other conscious and, are we all, those kind of questions are the ones I think it's like, stumbling into the dark forest. It's like we'd rather, argue about the trivialities, I think, than kind of get into the deep stuff. But this is our test. This is a moment. What are we going to do with it? What are you going to do with the extra time you're spending at home?
It also seems like people use those terms. God is another one that people just throw around God and like, oh yeah, I know, I talk to God, I pray to God. But if you ask them, who is God? What is God? There isn't going to be that much of an answer more than like a line or two that you can hear or read anywhere else. And it seems like it reminds me of what Stephen Hawking said, that the biggest enemy of knowledge is not lack of it, but the illusion of it. And it seems like we're just looking for things and elements to prove ourselves right. But we don't know that the one who's looking to be proven right is not us.
Yeah. It's one of the, do you believe what you believe? It's a big, like you said, people throw around phrases like God. It's like, well, do you really believe what you believe?
Yeah.
Is this something that you really think that there is an entity and that's controlling the universe? Or, it's the same thing with spiritual types. And you can find some spiritual types that on one hand say we're all connected, and then they're flipping someone off because, they're not wearing a mask. And then, or they'll put, everyone in this thing of, well, we're all interconnected except this person.
Yeah.
And so it's tough, do you believe what you believe? That's a tough question that we could take this time and really contemplate on.
And who's the you? That's another. And who is the you? Because let's say in our conversation, in not you and me, but in a common two people conversation, there are four different versions of each individual, right? The one who you think you are, the one who you want other person to think you are, the one who you think the other person think you are, and the one that you want other person and the one who you really are, right? So this is like we haven't even found the definition of you and I, and we go around and collect different degrees and collect different certifications and credentials, basically to align everybody else according to our objectives and ethics and morality. And we use everything that we can, culturally, socially, politically, to prove that, hey, what I'm telling you is right. Just follow what I'm saying and it's all going to be all right. And
in the end, what we're trying to do is convince ourselves that we are a we.
Yeah.
Like I am an I, and I'm going to do everything I can to convince that there really is such a thing. I mean, we spend so much time, like you said, doing whatever we can because we can. I think we know that's the same kind of concept of anything else that we're trying to really define. If you nudge it a little bit, if you push it a little bit, we have to admit that we don't really know.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite all-time questions, and I could spend so much time just, what do we mean? Like, we just start a conversation, and then you stop the conversation, and you say, oh, I noticed you said I. I'm like, what do you mean by that? And what do you mean when you say I?
Yeah.
What do you? And to me, I've come up with 1,000 different explanations, so many different definitions of who I think I am. I realize that that's all I am, is who I think I am at that particular time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fluid.
What else? It changes so much and so fast that it amazes me that anyone could possibly take it seriously. You could be all confident and like I always think of Denzel in Training Day, and you're going to go in there and then some little happens and you fall apart like George Costanza, and it's like wow, there's no consistency in the self. It's continuously fluid and changing, And I'm like, how do we ever fall for it? How do we? I don't know. Like you said, we spend a lot of time trying to convince ourselves that there is something behind there, you know?
Well, it's also the brainwashing and propaganda that we were all exposed to, some more than others. I think I mentioned I was born in Iran, and the second I was born, I was labeled as a Shia Muslim Iranian straight male. Now, good luck changing any of those throughout your entire life, because it's like, hey, you're born into this tribe. This is what we expect of you, and you have to live your life accordingly. And I didn't. You know, I'm male. I have no problem with male, but I literally changed all of it, and I got alienated by that community, by that society, because, you know, how dare you not talking about glorious history of Iran, or how dare you not being straight, or anything like. It's just like all of this nonsense that you're being born into, and then continue repeating it because you are convinced that one more day, $1,000 more, another degree, and it's all gonna be fine. And
Yeah.
it's a road to
Well,
nowhere.
it's funny how you put that. The more I can convince you that you are you, the more I am ultimately convince me that there's an I in there somewhere.
Absolutely.
If I can categorize and label you, I feel a little bit better that there's something in me that's also fits these labels. If I can get you to buy the story, then I buy the story a little bit. There's a quote I've been pondering on from Krishnamurti for years, and it always sort of irritated me. And I think that tells you something. And I'm just going to paraphrase it. It's something like, if you categorize yourself in any way, you know, whether it's religion or any kind of identification with some category, you are committing an act of violence. And it always kind of bothered me. I'm like, come on, man. That's, you know, is it really violent? And I think I can understand a little bit more what he's saying. You know, the second I categorize myself and affiliate with some, I'm limiting myself from possibilities. You know, I'm fitting myself into a certain group. That means automatically I'm denying myself some other membership. And I'm kind of like, I'm building, I'm taking like ever increasingly smaller boxes to put myself in. And then what happens when you find people like you who you're just like, no, I'm not going to do it. And it irritates people.
Yeah.
They're like, why won't you just fit into the box?
Yeah,
And you're
they
like,
get offended.
yeah. And you're just, I'm not doing it. I'm not playing that game.
Yep.
And it sets some people off, you know. They want you to play. You know, it's like any game we play. You know, if you kind of start making up some rules during the game, it can be irritating. But then you're just like, well, look, I'm playing a different game. And
And, you know, some days I'm more in the mood, and I'm like, I throw something out, and I just look at people peeling this onion that they define themselves by trying to convince me that, no, look, I'm older, or I've worked for government for 20 years, or I have 2 PhDs, so obviously I'm right. So just admit it. I'm like, no, I'm not going to admit it. I don't care who you are. This is what I think, and what I think is just as accurate as what you think. And
yeah, and it's interesting you would phrase it like that because a friend of mine, not all these professors, and there's almost a movement where they're trying to push reputation as a factor to take into consideration when you're trying to ascertain the truth. And there's this push like, look, we really have to. And I'm like, no, reputation is kind of irrelevant. I don't care who's saying what. It's really like, let me just evaluate the argument. And, you know, I'm not particularly interested in who says it. But yet there seems to be this push because, you know, it makes life a little more comfortable. If I say, well, look, I've got these letters after my name.
yeah,
And I tell my students all the time as a joke, I'm like, you know, the whole PhD thing is a complete social construct. I mean, it exists literally because a couple people agreed on, okay, we'll put these letters after your name. And it's like this kind of shady deal that goes on, but it goes on to such an extent that everyone they don't realize that it's this kind of backdoor deal. It's like, okay, well, this person did this and this, and we'll give them this kind of like, you know, status. And it's like, well, okay, I mean, I guess we'll buy into it like any other social contract, but there's just not much behind it.
yeah. I mean, there really isn't that much of a difference between Yale faculties and graduates and Freemasons. It's like a group of people who go through a process and they receive a credential based on which they are respected, they have the name, and or any other group or tribe or this kind of institution, right? To create, to solidify uncertainty and sell it to people as something certain.
Yeah, it's interesting. You would connect that with certainty, and I think that's kind of the ultimate quest of the thinking mind. It's even though it's a complete illusion, it wants to find that certainty, and one of the ways that you can find predictability and certainty and just a kind of orderliness. That's the thing. If you put us all in the categories, it's like taking your desk and you finally organize it all, which I almost never do. But some people are really prone to that. And they like to have everything. The more organized you are, the more predictable everything is. Mm-hmm. And for some people, that's very, very pleasing. And I probably mentioned the last time we talked, I probably mentioned Ian McGilchrist and his wonderful book, The Master and His Emissary, where he talks about how our culture in the West, we're obsessed with bureaucracy, and we're obsessed with paperwork, and it's all about control. These people will want you to sign paperwork to get forms to order more forms, and you can't help but to laugh about it occasionally. Yeah. Well, you want me to sign this? You really want me to put a scribble on a piece of paper? And these traditions go back thousands of years. But we're continuously trying to create order. I just did a video the other day about order and chaos, and how and I kind of centered it around that 70s show, Get Smart, which I vaguely remember as a kid. But it was this funny kind of play between the chaos agents who were evil. They were just like this element of randomness, and we can't have that. So the control agents would continuously battle it out to find order in chaos. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. The more you can label me and find me a PhD, then it makes things more predictable. You don't expect PhDs to do certain things. And to me, nature has always been more of a wild ride into the unpredictable. And it's a wonderful thing. Like even right now, you don't really know what I'm going to say next.
Yeah.
And to me, that's very interesting.
Oh, that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. And if I know more predictably what you're going to do in a conversation, it's fine. And I have plenty of conversations like that. But to me, I'd always gravitate towards, exploring the unpredictable a little bit rather than the comfort of predictability. But that's an unusual thing, I think, in our culture. Most people would rather trade the comfort of predictability for the unknown. But I think that's our real adventure, is to just take a step into and that's what we're dealing with right now. Like I said before, no one wants to admit that we don't know what's going to happen, and in a way that makes life very interesting, to not know what's going to happen. What could be more boring than really? We say we want predictability, but we don't really want it.
Yeah.
At the same time, now we're complaining about, every day it's like Groundhog's Day. Every day is the same. And it's like, well, you wanted predictability. Now you got it completely. Yeah. It's not as much fun as you thought it was going to be, is it? We want that element of adventure and unpredictability, and the universe offers us that. That's the thing about nature. It's always been, you think you're going to get something, and it throws you a curve all the time.
Yeah, this podcasting has been a very interesting experience about what you're talking about. That I'm mostly interested in people who, again, as you said, I don't know what they're going to talk about. Like I had John McAfee a couple episodes back on the podcast. Had no idea what he was going to say. He's a fugitive now. And he started drinking right off the bat. And he said, this is what I'm going to be. I'm like, awesome. I'm looking forward to see what's coming out of this. But there are some people who they ask for questions beforehand, before coming to the show. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you the first question, and then something comes to my mind. I'm going to ask you that. And then maybe some kind of a short rant come to my mind. I'm going to say that. And this is how it's going to be. But some
And
people
that's
are very, very afraid of stepping into the unknown. And I think that is exactly the point that I keep telling people around me, who we usually gather a small group of people experimenting with psychedelics. Now, I've been doing it for more than 10 years. These guys have been doing it for a few years. So it's really awesome for me to just be there available to, as they're saying, tie the knots or open some doors that they didn't even know existed through conversation, and creating momentary, temporarily order out of chaos and then move back to the chaos. So it's all about, as I'm telling them, hey, whatever you're afraid of the most, that is your indicator to go right through it, face it right away. And Joseph Campbell also, I came across a quote there saying, the cave you're afraid of the most has the treasure that you seek. But it seems like people are paralyzed by fear and they're not even willing to give it a shot. How would they snap out of it?
Yeah, and if you get into some of the mythology, the Grail myths, and there's an old saying that, the Grail castle is always down the road to the left, and and I mean, and I think one of the meanings of that is like, look, this adventure, dealing with life as an adventure, it's always right there in front of you, but it's a terrifying choice. And I think it was Kierkegaard who said that, that just the idea of being free, just the idea that right now I could say or do something, like anything, like that's so overwhelming for people that they would really choose to not indulge at all. They don't want to play the game. It's too terrifying. And so we choose not to choose. We get into these very predictable social roles that, it's very comforting. And I can understand it. There's some days I think, wow, man, I would kind of really like to just live a normal life, not have opened this jar of consciousness and existence and and be an accountant or sell insurance and just, and take the whole thing like seriously. And I have moments like this. I won't kid you that I don't. So I can kind of empathize, that kind of existence. I think it's quote normal for people. I think the vast majority of our species, I think that's the path we choose. And it's the anomalies like you are just like, look, let's just, let's open the door of chaos and let's sit in really interesting anticipation. What's going to happen next? Yeah. Because I don't know, and you don't know. No one knows. And that's what makes the whole thing so fascinating to me. And so, you could really and I think that the kind of adventurous types in terms of evolution, I think there's always been maybe 10% or less of the adventurous types to keep existence interesting. But the the vast majority are the types that just, go down that path that 1,000 other people have taken. And that's good for the species in a way, I suppose. You can't have that's why people like me marry people like my wife. She keeps me grounded. If I married someone like me, would be like, sleeping on the side of a river somewhere, hanging out in the woods. Yeah. Just, I can appreciate a certain type of grounding. And, but, I think even for those types, you can open the door a little bit, have a little bit of an adventure. You don't have to go trip and, completely lose your identity. You can have, small versions of it, and sometimes I think that works too.
We talked about institutions and professors and PhDs and all that. One of the trends that keep coming up in the past few episodes is how these institutions have monopolized resources for specific fields to be studied. I use physics as an example that for decades, supposedly, the only field that money would have gone to was string theory. So it didn't matter how good of an argument you had. It didn't matter what good of a research you wanted to do. If it was not string theory, it would have been shunned because the apparatus of that institution had capitalized on string theory and like this is the answer. Again, certainty. So we're talking about consciousness as understanding it being basically the most important thing that we can even ponder about or begin to understand it. But how would that be possible in this kind of a situation? If you go to the biggest universities and like, we want to study consciousness. Okay, what it's all about, we don't know.
Yeah, because the fundamentals behind the university is that there's an answer and that we'll give you an answer
Yeah.
and that students are paying for an answer. I mean, when I start my consciousness class every semester, I come out and tell them, like, look, I'm going to babble on and there's going to be a lot of sounds coming out of my mouth. But in the end, no one has a clue about what consciousness really is. And that, to me, is the adventurous part of this class. That we get to admit that but it's still fun to talk about. As I always say, the Tao Te Ching comes right out and says, look, anything I say isn't the true Tao, but what the heck, I'm going to go talk about it anyway.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do. But academia doesn't want to hear that. Academia, so I kind of sneak mine in. But the truth is, academia wants results. And results mean it's the same thing I was talking about early on when I said we don't want to admit that we don't know. To be an honest institution, so many fields in physics and philosophy should just come out and say, look, there's stuff we really don't know, but that doesn't sell well. It's much easier to sell a package that, look, we know this stuff. And here's the package of knowledge. And if you pay this money for a tuition, you're gonna come out feeling like you know something. And I've told my students for years, when you get your PhD, you should have an overwhelming sensation of how little you know. You should recognize that there's so little that you know. You should feel overwhelmingly ignorant. People, that's not a great sell for people. People, they're not, that's not a like pep talk. People don't want to that's not like your speech to get people in the graduate school. The thinking mind is obsessed with this notion that we can know and the universe is knowable. I think Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And I'm like, no. It isn't. It's not.
Yeah.
And the thinking mind gets very frustrated. It may not be. I'm not saying that I know with certainty that it isn't. I just question whether it is. Maybe it isn't. And that maybe is enough for some people. It turns them off, I think.
Really, the most interesting argument in favor of predictability and orderly nature of universe to me is coming from people who are working on artificial intelligence and algorithms. And their argument is that anything that is not quantifiable is therefore chaotic. But philosophically speaking, if we digitized everything and allow the processing power to be able to process it, which would be artificial general intelligence, for example, even the waves of the ocean and the flux of bird flying would be predictable and measurable. So that is a very interesting argument, but again, there is no certainty that is the answer either.
The artificial intelligence is such an interesting field because I think in some ways they make the mistake the most explicitly, in the sense that they're creating artificial minds, and just admit it, you're creating artificial thinking minds.
Yeah.
So you're taking the thinking mind, the element of, it's not consciousness. So in my class, I teach a class on artificial intelligence, and this is one of the main points of the class is like, we may replicate the thinking mind. And in fact, we've already replicated the thinking mind. And the more the thinking mind becomes replicated, the more predictable. I think there are certain things about the thinking mind that are incredibly predictable. But that's it. We're not replicating consciousness, and we're not replicating, and it's such an interesting thing. I can appreciate people who would have such an incredible goal that we could, in principle, predict the flight changes in a flock of birds, or the way the ocean, the waves, something so fundamentally unpredictable. My gut, which who knows how fine-tuned that is, but I would say it's probably never going to happen. But I do also find it very interesting that someone would hold that position. Like, well, to me, that's a fascinating kind of adventure too. The kind of thing, maybe we could predict the unpredictable.
I think it's also the terminology too, because with AI, actually, I had the gentleman who coined the term along with two other people, Peter Voss, on the podcast. He coined the term artificial intelligence in early 90s, and artificial general intelligence, AGI is what he coined. But I like to think of that A as not artificial, but augmented intelligence, because there is no need to recreate a machine that is working in the way that our human brain does. But augmenting it to be able to experience in a more expanded kind of a way is a very interesting notion to me. And especially now, are you familiar with Neuralink, Elon Musk's?
Yes, yeah.
So what do you think about that? Because that's what it does. His whole thing is that you put this implantable human computer interface to expand the capability of your brain and heal the parts of it that are damaged. Therefore, you'll be able to receive the information at a rate that will be comparable to an AI system, because his argument is that there is no way that we can compete with these machines, which I agree with, in a sense that we are creating a completely non-Darwinian kind of an event here. What are your thoughts about that?
I would guess that what's going to happen is, and that to the extent that we figure out the brain, and we've done a great job in terms of figuring out the thinking mind. Fields of psychology, we've mapped out hundreds of different flaws the thinking mind is susceptible to. And so one of the nice things, like you said, we could augment this, and we can come up with a better version of the thinking mind, one that's not going to make all the flaws that the human mind does. And at the same time, we can also go in and tweak the human brain and kind of upgrade it. My guess is, though, these are all going to be really significant in terms of how we think about the world. I don't see them as doing anything that's going to genuinely expand actual consciousness. I'm not convinced, and there's no science behind this except to say I'm still not terribly convinced that the brain alone gives rise to consciousness. And so then no matter how much you tweak the brain, yes, it may give us insights. We may be able to think faster. We may be able to even hold more than one thought at a time. But the fundamentals of actual conscious experience, I just don't see it happening. But I absolutely could be wrong. In fact, it would be it's one of those things that would be really fascinating. And I would be happy to admit, like, I was wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, if they ever had
yeah.
Well, if they ever come up with a theory of consciousness, I would be the first person to happily say I was wrong. Like, wow, they figured out something that I was so convinced was unable to ever be figured out. And so,
theory of consciousness. A theory of consciousness sounds to me like trying to make sense out of something that is unknowable by design, because it includes everything and anything and all of its expressions, and it just like, you try to, with current level of our understanding, try to predict if you pour water on the ground, which direction would it go to and at what rate would it be absorbed.
Or even something as simple as, what is it going to rain in the next 15 minutes? I mean, again, it's that war on nature, right? In war in the sense that we're trying to figure it out, predict it, so we can ultimately control it. And so far, we haven't won. We haven't done very well in it. But we could change things around. I don't know. The theories on consciousness right now, I mean, none of them even come close. I mean, it's almost a contradiction to talk about a theory of consciousness, because by its very definition, a theory is something that the mind does.
Yeah.
Theories, they're limited to the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is just so, it's so small, and it can think in one thing at a time. I mean, that's the way the thinking mind is, but everything's happening at the universe all at once, and I mean, even right now, I mean, my thinking mind is processing maybe 1/1000th, maybe probably far less than that, of all the things. Like, somehow I'm doing my blood chemistry, I'm beating my heart, I'm doing an infinite amount of operations right now, and on top of it is this small little thinking mind. It can't even become aware of the workings of what's going on in my own body, and yet I'm supposed to figure out the mysteries of the universe.
Yeah.
And So I don't know.
What are some of the theory of consciousness?
There's a couple really popular theories, Tononi, and my favorite, this is an old one going back to Daniel Dennett, and and they're all interesting theories, but they're more theories about the thinking mind, and they do a very good job of showing how the thinking mind processes information and all this, but none of them come close to explaining what in philosophy is called the hard problem, which is really just consciousness itself. And there isn't even a theory that comes close to dealing with the hard problem, And that's because the hard problem isn't the hard problem. The hard problem may be the impossible problem when it comes to the thinking mind. We have this terrible thinking problem in our country, and the world is not necessarily like this. There are other places in the world they don't think as much as we do, and they don't think as much about thinking as we do. So it's not so much that we think all the time, but we think quite a bit about our thinking. And it sets us on this path. Like if we just think enough, we'll figure this out. And you could see all the scientists rushing to come up with a cure and for a vaccine, or everyone fighting it out because they really think that what's going on right now is a thinking problem. And if you just think enough, thinking problems will be solved. But that's just a hypothesis. It may not be a thinking problem at all. It may be something, like Einstein's quote about, the level of analysis that got us into this problem isn't going to get us out. I mean, really, maybe the way out is not the way we came in.
Yeah.
And so, maybe we have to, recognize the limitations of the thinking mind, and maybe there's other options to thinking our way out of this. And people say, it's such it's such a foreign and strange way to propose the solution to a problem, because we're so taught, we're so enculturated, so socialized to believe that thinking is the way out of every problem, that we can't even conceptualize a scenario where thinking wasn't the answer. And there's this wonderful culture, and I wish I could remember a little bit more in terms of where their location, a very small culture. In fact, they're on the verge of extinction. I don't know if maybe I brought it up last time, I can't remember. And they are a culture that probably is our best example on the planet of a culture they simply don't think. They don't think the way they don't even use language, they sing. So the way they communicate is, in essence, by like whistling a tune or humming a couple lines. That's the way they communicate.
Which part of the world?
I wish I could.
Okay.
I'm so bad with details like that. It's some language. But the funny thing is, you can't even pronounce their culture correctly, because to pronounce their culture correctly, you have to have the right intonation. So, and the intonation is everything, which was all right-brained. And so it's almost like this one little place on the planet, and they had 400 people, and I think they're down to 200. So it's like they're all virtually extinct. But they had so little need for the past and the future. I'll send you the YouTube clip on this, because it's a wonderful YouTube clip to watch on. And it was a missionary who went there to convert them to Christianity. And what he discovered is when he started talking about the past, they had no need for the past. And they had no need for the future. So they're like, what are you so worried about this guy if he's long been dead? What do you care about heaven? Heaven's this thing that's going to happen. They just couldn't understand how someone would put the past and the future over the present moment. And that's the wonderful thing about, when I mentioned how on the weekends I try to the best that I can, process reality with something other than the thinking mind. And when you do this, you're immediately thrown into the present moment. And the wonderful, amazing thing about the present moment is there's no problems.
Yeah.
And these individuals were described as the happiest people on the planet. They were almost continuously smart. They were just joyful. Because what could be more joyful than losing the thinking mind? And now again, we don't necessarily want to just shut that all off, because the thinking mind can be a very good tool when we want to turn it on. And there's probably times when we could probably solve certain problems with it. It would be very helpful. Our problem is we think that the thinking mind is the answer to every. So we're like turning it up to 11, like that amp on spinal. Like we want to crank it up, like past, even its own limitations. And because we're so convinced that if we just think, we will eventually think our way out of this mess. And I'm not sure we will. I think, maybe these are these moments. What would happen? Think about the possibilities now. What would happen if people recognized the opportunity of this situation and they started having time that was quiet, meditative? It could be disastrous in a way for the thinking mind. People may realize that they don't need their jobs as much as they thought they did.
Yeah.
They don't need the 9-to-5 life. They don't need the social identities that have been thrown on them. Who knows how many people may wake up to this idea that this life that they have been living was a fiction, was a collective fiction that was thrown on them. Sometimes, like you said, since birth, people have thrown, and all of a sudden they may realize, look, I don't need this. I don't need anything else except exactly what's happening right now. And that's what that culture seemed to exemplify. They were just so pleased with what was happening at the present moment. They found that nothing else was actually necessary. And that's a very dangerous thing in a culture that wants to control and because you can't control someone in the present moment. Yeah. A person who's in the present moment is absolutely happy with everything that they have. The only way I can control you is if I get you to believe you need something, and then you'll do certain things to get that. So.
Now, it just came to my mind. What is really interesting for me to try to understand is whether or not at some point in our history, there were a group of people who realized exactly what you're talking about, that we need to depend people on certain products and services based on past and future, and we have to get them away from the present, which suggests to me if there were people like that, they were enlightened themselves. They just realized that, hey, we know what's going on. We just want to enslave everyone else. Do you think that there was a group of people or civilization at some point that they set basically in motion this apparatus that had evolved to become what we are calling our civilization today?
It's an interesting I don't know. Sometimes I think those types, again, like I said, the controlling types that do seem to gravitate towards our leaders and the ones who seem to be controlling the show in so many superficial ways. It's a very interesting question, and sometimes you do want to sort of get into their skull and figure out what's going on. Like, do you really know what's going on with all this stuff, or are you just as blind to it as everyone else? I mean, it's a fascinating, kind of trick of empathy just to see if you could get into their world. I don't know. I think either way, it would be interesting. Certainly our enlightened, this idea. I mean, it didn't do a lot for progress. This idea that societies are will invent better tools and we'll invent better, cars, and I mean, to have this idea, like always wanting that next better thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe that's a genetic trait that we're programmed in a way, or if we're not programmed, we're very susceptible to the idea that the next better thing is genuinely possible.
Don't you see it as a necessity in order to survive? Because I actually had this conversation yesterday that we evolved with our technology because one group of our ancestors, they invented the wheel and discovered fire, and the other group look at them and like, oh, they have those. We got to build them a little better so we can defeat them. And this feedback loop went on and on and on and on, which to me suggests that wars and conflicts themselves are as natural as humanity itself, because it has pushed us forward to where we are today.
Yeah. Have you read the book Sapiens?
Yes, by Yuval Harari. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I love his description of how, long the planet has been around, and human beings, I mean, we act like we own this place. We've been here such a fraction of this.
Yeah.
We haven't even like unpacked our stuff. We've just arrived, and we act like we've been here forever. And then you take a look at the thinking mind. That cognitive revolution that happened about 40,000 years ago with Homo sapiens, and it's very possible that the whole thing you're talking about could have been that could have been behind the cognitive revolution. It's just this idea that I need something better, a better tool, a better weapon, and that's the reason. Like literally, this idea that I could be a better self or I could have a better something. In a way, we owe our existence to it. Because if you look around, all you see are Homo sapiens. You don't see Neanderthal. You don't see any of the other species of humans that were walking the. We did away with all of them.
Yeah, we annihilated all of them.
Yeah. So we won.
Yeah.
And we won because maybe this program of like, look, I can be a better me, and I could have more, and you can feel that. And it's sort of an ironic, another guitar or another car or another, slightly bigger house. And you can, and it's so interesting because in a way you can intellectually know that you don't need that, but you still feel it. And it's like part of us, part of our species. So instead of just being completely critical of it, sometimes I am grateful for it because I'm like, look, here I am, I was having this discussion with my son, and we were talking about and he was like, well, what would have happened if Neanderthals had won? He's like, would I still be me? I'm like, I don't know, no, probably not. So, so in a way we can criticize the need for more, but in another way, I think we can be grateful for it. The problem is this need for more has outlived itself. It's outlived its usefulness. I mean, we've run it up to the point that people are going to be trillionaires now. I mean, that you can see that need for more is just like, do we really need to be a trillionaire? I mean, who need, it's almost kind of like embarrassing. I mean, do you really need that? I mean, how many things do you need? And I'm not being hypocrite. I mean, I've got 6 guitars. Do I really need 6 guitars? And people could say, people could throw this on me, and I'd say, no, I don't need them. But so it's probably outlived itself. And I think as a species, we're going to be slow. I mean, people always think, well, what's happening this year? But our species, it goes in tens of thousands of years. Before, I mean, it may take us another 1,000 years before we recognize these impulses. And the direction the culture could really, take that could bring about some substantive changes. So,
Yeah, in the context of human evolution and technological evolution, I think the individual who not only understood it better than most, but he made it into one of the masterpieces of our civilization, 2001: Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick. That the monkey finds a bone and realizes that it can crush the skull. The first thing it does, it hunts to feed its family. But the second thing it does, it kills the leader of the other monkey group to preserve the water supply for themselves. And then the bone goes up and turns into a rocket. It's just a masterpiece in the level that I think most people don't even understand what that movie is talking about. That even just the beginning of it, that first 20 minutes.
I show that in class at the beginning of my consciousness class, because I think it's a wonderful example of the birth of the thinking mind. And you see one of our ancestors and their first thought. And like you said, I mean, it becomes practical. And it becomes making things better. And so, hey, I finally found a tool. And it is interesting because even in the movie, they got it right. And this is what I think Ian McGilchrist talks about, how the left brain controls the right hand. And of course, most of us are right-handed. And that's how we control and manipulate the world. And we use things for purposes that they were not intended for. This is a bone, but the left brain says, well, it's not a bone. It's a weapon. And all of a sudden, then you go and, you figured out how to, it's a tool. And now I can feed my family. And you're right, that two of the biggest things, take care of my needs and make my life better. But then also this kind of, competition for resources. Yeah. You stole my watering hole, and now monkey got to go back and take back the watering hole. And it did it through absolute violence. It was an incredibly violent scene. And so it's kind of like its message, like, okay, what was the first thing the thinking mind did? Violence was the first thing, and violence was the second thing. And so the thinking mind is like, you know, it's an extremely powerful tool, but we also have to realize its origins, you know, and the first thing the thinking mind did was take care of thyself. You know, that's what it did. It took care of the self. And so maybe that was the birth of when we started, you know, where did the self come? When did it come online? You know, and so when I talk to consciousness researchers, that's the first thing when I say, okay, your theory of consciousness, when did it come online? So if we look at humans, and we've been on the planet for about 2.5 million years, and then it's only this short time ago that we started thinking. But were we conscious before we started thinking? You know, so like in the movie, that beginning. So, I mean, were they conscious? Well, of course they were conscious. They just weren't thinking. Thinking added a certain element, a new type of consciousness. But they were certainly consciousness before then. And that's the thing that consciousness theories are not addressing. They're not addressing, you know, well, what kind of consciousness is a mouse experiencing? You know, what kind of consciousness is a dog experience, you know, or all the other mammals or any other thing on the planet, perhaps. I mean, that's changing a little bit now with all the panpsychism stuff, but it's been a really slow change. And so, but yeah, it's funny you would talk about that because that beginning to 2001, I've been showing that in class, and the students just they get blown away with it. I'm like, look, this is a possible way. This is a possible scenario of how like humans with their first thought, you know, and what did we think, you know?
It's also interesting to contemplate what happened to the group of monkey who lost their leader, getting killed by that bone. Did they went and they found another bone, but they put like a thorn on the top of it. They upgraded it. Now they killed that group, and the remainder of that group they upgrade the weapon and so on and so forth.
Oh, I'm sure that, I mean, and that's exactly what, like when a bone gets thrown into the sky and it turns into satellite. I mean, that's a real good representation of that. We're playing the same game. We just have fancier tools to do it with.
Yeah.
And we're doing it in probably not as violent of ways. And so, you know, when we out tech someone, or we, you know, show them up at work, or we come up with a better program, or, you know, these are like same versions of it, but, you know, far less violent in an explicit way. But it's the same game. And it's always centered around the self. You know, people don't come up with, like, I don't go out to try to reinvent something so I can give it to someone else. I mean, when we reinvent, like we're trying to invent stuff to improve our situation.
Yeah.
Like right now, you know, why are we really suddenly people are trying to come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus? Well, why? Because we're intellectually interested in it? No, you know, we're doing it to, you know, and that same level. We're trying to come up with a better weapon, a better bone with, you know, a thorn in it, so it works more effectively. You know.
Yeah, it's interesting. One part of this whole equation with respect to coronavirus is that the virus could have escaped the lab. Doesn't mean that it was bioengineered. It just means that they were, as you said, they had intellectual curiosity and interest in studying it and upgrading it. And because they're not taking as much care about their facilities in Wuhan, for example, in China, it just escaped the lab.
Yeah.
It's possible.
A lesson we should have learned from Jurassic Park. You know, the whole, you know, movie centered around this idea that nature finds a way, and we think we can contain it within the lab. But you know, that's a very arrogant, egotistical thing. And we can't control it, and it finds a way. And no matter how many precautions we take, and you know, try to control things. I mean, you can't even control drugs in prison. And so you think, well, here's a system of ultimate control, and we, you know, but drugs are still, they get into the system, and then we think we're going to control nature, and so who knows what that scenario was, but you know, it's certainly possible.
Yeah, especially when nature, in many aspects of it, it operates on an exponential basis. I think this is a very good opportunity also for people to realize that even though we connect to our reality in a linear way. As you said, we can only think about one thinking at the same time. Nature doesn't work like that. It's quantum and it's exponential. So it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes 1, 2, 4, 8, And by the time you get to the 30th step, you're already at 1 billion.
Yep. Yeah. And that's the thing too. It's, when you take a look at our evolution, we were in tribes of maybe 100, 150. And so the thinking mind is extremely limited when it comes to how many numbers we can come up with. And all of a sudden we're thrown into this world where people are talking about millions and there's billions and all these statistics, which are, just very difficult for the thinking mind to deal with. And it gets very, I think thinking mind is just frustrated because, the vast majority of our existence was dealing with groups of 100. This is why, I forget what the number is, but it's this idea that, it can only really know 100 people. That's anything beyond that, our mind just can't deal with. And so we may have 1,000 social media friends, but the truth is you can't know all of them. But now the way information is communicated on the planet, we're not dealing with 100 people. Suddenly we're a global entity, and it's like here we are, we're pretty good at juggling 3 balls, and we're okay with that. But nature has like an infinite number of balls, and we're trying to, and it just the whole thing just fell apart. We couldn't even comprehend how we could possibly do it. And people keep throwing the numbers at us, but the mind can't deal with numbers over about 150.
Yeah, this difference is very important, and I've talked about this a lot. How the sense of certainty that our parents have had nothing to do with reality. It just had everything to do with limited channels of interpretation and distribution of information that you would watch, maybe CNN, PBS, and Fox. When I was growing up in Iran, we had 3 national channels eventually. And it was like, this is all you need to know. So eventually people started putting satellite dishes on their rooftops, and the government was coming down hard on people because it's all about that. You have more information, your mind realizes that, oh, I have more options to choose from. But the thing is, why are you making those choices to begin with? That's the part that nobody has talked about.
Yeah, and it can be even something as simple. People have talked about this with consumerism. I mean, it used to be like, look, you had 2 different types of cereals you could pick from in the morning, and now you've got like, a whole row filled with different types of, and you don't even know, we can't even pick out what kind of cereal we're going to have in the morning. And so how are we going to pick out what kind of, and then you have to, it's, again, that seriousness. I was like, look, you got to take your news channel seriously. I mean, but how can you possibly pick the news channel? How do I know which source to really go with? I mean, there's so many to choose from. It's just overwhelming. I mean, because we've in one generation went from, like you said, something manageable, 3 stations maybe, to an infinite number of stations that you can tune into on any social media platform, and we're connected not just with a small group of people, but we're literally connected with the world, and that's going to get these wonderful conspiracy theories going. But then we don't know what to make of them because who knows? How do you make this assertion as to validity? There's no supreme, who guards the guards? It's just this free for all with, everyone has access. Like, look, we're talking, we could talk about whatever we want, and then someone could watch this. And it's kind of, again, I think we could look at it in a positive way. It's like an interesting time when we can, dig a little deeper and figure out what we believe. And so we can watch things and you stumble on some YouTube channel and maybe you've never seen the person before, but that's okay because I don't care about their reputation. I'm just going to ascertain whether I think they've got an interesting thing to say, so maybe it could turn out to be kind of interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that was exactly why YouTube became as big as they became, but exactly because of this loss of monopoly of quote unquote authoritative sources that they're shutting down people who will come up with any kind of an argument, any kind of a narrative that goes against the status quo. So they trying to control, again, something that is inherently uncontrollable. And again, it could be really good, it could be really bad, and I think all of this would make sense once you have some kind of an objective or a goal to assess these steps and events on that basis. But there is no such a thing as a collective objective or a goal. So, you know,
We just have to wing it. Again, um, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's an unprecedented moment in the sense that we're bombarded with lots of new information, and you can feel that kind of like I know my daughter was doesn't even, sometimes she doesn't even want to touch a computer because it's too overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so like some people are just going to kind of shut down with it because the human mind just it's just a little too overwhelming for it. And we'll see, it's not a great positive message to say, look, we're just going to have to kind of sit through the movie and wait to see the ending. But there's some truth to that. No one knows what's going to happen, and that could be a positive thing. We're just going to have to wait it out. I mean, it's a yin and yang to everything. And even though we're bombarded with an infinite number of news sources right now, in a way that is like YouTube is really, it's a fascinating thing too. In some ways, I've stumbled on people's that I would have never, interacted with on any level a couple generations ago. And I mean, even us talking, a couple generations ago, we would have never connected and had conversation, and yet here we are. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to understand. I'm just quoting what you have behind you. I believe it's from your book, No Self, No Problem, that you do not exist to serve the illusion. The illusion exists to serve you. And that really is the key of it all. Let me also show your book to our viewers, No Self, No Problem, how a neuropsychology is catching up to Buddhism. Very few people are having these conversations. Kapil Gupta, I don't know if you know him. I send you a link. He had a interview with Naval Ravikant. They're talking about the same thing and the truth, basically, that the truth is not good or bad, is not one way or another. It's basically my interpretation of what is being discussed here, and with those people and few others that I've come across, is that instead of looking outward for more and more and more, you have to look inward for less and less and less until you get to nothingness. Because nothingness is a very interesting concept to ponder about, that everything has been created and built so impermanently on some kind of a structure, and that structure is nothingness. But that goes against all of our teachings in society and culture and school, that hey, you just do this, so you gain this. You do this. It's a gamified kind of a society that makes us lose the point altogether.
We've been taught, be someone.
Yeah.
Be someone, do something, and to craft this art of carving away all the superfluous stuff and finding out who you are. And like you said, though, it's a very interesting trip to explore nothingness, and that there's a very interesting link between nothingness and consciousness. And it's very difficult to put into words.
Yeah. Words don't belong to that realm. That's another thing.
It doesn't, and it shows you what a infinitely small slice of existence words are capable of describing. And we put so much emphasis on words here in the West, but they're extremely limited. And that's the thing. So the self becomes this kind of almost a linguistic. It's so tied in with words, and it shows you that same kind of like, if people just explore this a day. Okay, well, what is your problems? What's really going on? And then you discover, well, they're my problems. And the wonderful thing about this experience of no self is as soon as you do away with the self as a linguistic tool, that's all it is. It's this thing we've come up with that helps us interact with people, and it's a convenience. And that's all it is. It's a thought of who we think we are. And the moment you can come up with that and experience it and embrace it, even a little bit, you realize that the moment I realized that there is no self to begin with, every problem that you had goes along with that self. It goes away with it. And that's a very nice, light place to be.
Yes.
And it's and I'm convinced that if we ever have if we can ever connect with our intuition, if we can, which is to say, how do we solve a problem without thinking about it? It is to go deep into the nothingness, deep, lose ourselves in that, and see what happens. See what comes out of it. See what comes out of the nothing, and maybe a wonderful creative solution. That's where creativity always comes out of the nothingness. And that's the thing. We think, nothingness, what could come out of it? Again, it's not a logical argument, but something does come out of nothing. And sometimes some really good things come out of nothing. Some creative things that, I'm convinced that all good, interesting, creative ideas come out of the nothingness. And if we can collectively kind of indulge, who knows, maybe we'll find a very interesting way out of this, or maybe we won't want to find an interesting way out of it. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of it too. Who knows? we just gotta. We'll see. We'll see. Is Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory being discussed in academia at all? The theory that human brain evolved much faster than the rest of our body because our ape cousins and our ancestors started munching on some psychedelic substances.
Only from my students. My students will talk about Terence, but I have yet to have a discussion with another academic that would venture off into such ideas. And, it's a very interesting idea that, in terms of evolution, that certain psychedelics could have given us the kind of leadership, with kindness that might be really a great way to lead. I mean, I could have been a really important way to kind of, organize in a good way. And so, yeah, it's coming, it's there, but it's mostly a student-driven thing. You don't find too many of the actual academics talking about mushrooms. And, I think the whole psychedelic thing is letting go of if you're going to have a psychedelic adventure, don't bring your expectations along for the ride. Don't bring, it better be like this, or this is going to. I think the point is it's going to be an adventure, and it's going to take you into a place that you probably didn't think it was going to take you. And so it's not much of a surprise that academics who emphasize the thinking mind to such a high degree, I could see why they have downplayed, the psychedelics and why they've done. Well, that's a generalization. There certainly are some psychologists actually right now who are emphasizing the mushroom. In fact, in a way, although it's long overdue, the research on mushrooms and psychedelics in terms of treating depression and the cancer and people facing death, now that research is being taken kind of seriously, which is interesting,
Yeah, this comeback of psychedelic revolution in juxtaposition to everything that is happening is really interesting, because you're absolutely right that your expectations do not belong to that realm. You can take them with you, but that's why people have so-called bad trips. Because bad trip is not something that it just makes up for it. It's just something that you don't want to deal with. You put it in the back of your head. It just brings it right in front of you. Like, you have to deal with it, dude. You have to deal with it. And when you do stronger things like DMT, we talked about DMT last time, then it doesn't even matter what your intention is. You will be taken to a place where, to me, is the purest experience of nothingness that you can have, which is the reason I always find it ridiculous when people are like, well, what did you see? How did it feel? Why should I bring it to words?
Yeah.
Obviously they want to have some kind of an idea and certainty without trying it. And I'm just not serving that purpose, because it will defeat the whole point of doing something that does not belong to this world, literally.
And I think that's the funniest paradox. The thinking mind always wants to go into a place that it's impossible. It wants to go into the realm of the unthinking, the realm of being and nothingness. And you can't take the thinking mind there. It has no place there. And so, someone has a certain trip. Oh, explain to me your trip. And people, the person will just laugh. They'll be like, what do you want an answer? What kind of problem are you trying to solve?
Does the thinking mind interested in the unknown because of boosting its ego, or is it obviously it's not interested to defeat itself? Is that right?
I think the thinking mind is convinced that thinking is so important because it justifies its own existence in the same way that the self justifies its own existence. It's on a very thin thread. The thinking mind one, it's very new. I mean, 40,000 years sounds like a long time, but in cosmic terms, it's actually a very short
Or a
time.
weekend.
And yeah, and so it's been continuously trying to challenge the rest of reality and convincing itself that it's really that important. And when people trip and they have certain experiences and they realize how trivial, an important triviality the thinking mind is, I mean, we don't want to just lose it. I mean, it's helping us communicate right now. And so it has really wonderful things and it can help in certain ways. But to have that as your gravitational center of your universe, that's not going to work too well. I think when we venture off just for a little bit into the nothingness, and you come back and you say, yeah, I get this thinking mind thing, but I'm not going to try to tell you and explain to you what the trip was like. I mean, what kind of words would you want me to use?
Yeah, it's like reading books about what chocolate would taste like. You're never gonna know.
No, anything. Riding a bike, swimming. There's this. Playing a lot of things that we do. You do them, and to talk about them is just. It's like analyzing poetry. There's people out there, it's like, okay, if you want to take that trip and analyze, I mean, you can do it. And I've had my share of kind of looking into it a little bit, but, I'm not sure I could take such a trip too seriously. It's there as it's there. It's there for its own existence. And that's, and that's the center. When you make that kind of the center of your universe, the gravitational center of your universe, everything, it's hard to take anything too seriously at that point. And that's a good way to live. And I think if we could have a little bit, just a nudge, a little bit more of that in our culture, particularly at times like this, where you see collectively challenges that we're dealing with, make the thinking mind completely fall apart. And that's because we put the thinking mind as the center of our universe. And that's a dangerous thing to put at the center of your universe because it's so fragile. If you put the nothingness at the center, and that sounds strange to people, say, how can you have nothingness at the center of your universe? What have you been drinking? But those, who have been, they kind of know what you're talking about. Oh, yeah, and we deal with the thinking mind, and it would be very interesting to see how we would deal with certain problems like the one we're dealing with right now if we were coming from a place of centered nothingness. If that was our center and we recognize, and then, it'd be very interesting to see how it would be dealing with the situation and that from a different perspective. So
I think one of the best guides about how to get to, because as you said, you cannot get rid of the thinking mind. Trying to get rid of it is playing right into its hand. Again, Kapil Gupta, I think it described it really well, that where there was one, now there is two. You become an observer of your thinking mind rather than you split what is happening inside your head. That quote stuck with me. It's so simple and to the point. And also what Alan Watts talked about, that you just go somewhere and stay quiet for a month. And at first, it's going to be really difficult. Your mind is going crazy. By the time that you come down from the mountain, you will join any band of people. And you can cause a lot of problems because you don't have that center anymore to define what is good and what is bad. So there are guides, other than just smoking DMT, that I am not advocating the use of any psychedelics because I don't know where people are mentally. This is a choice that has to be made on you have to be very honest with yourself to realize where are you, who you are, and what you want to get out of it to the best of your ability. But there are ways, and you just, we have to get away from this whole noise. I think about it as shut up the noise so we can hear the music.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a great line. Yeah, the inner chatter, the monkey mind, if it can, it's a kind of like you said, it's a attentional problem, in a sense. Are you attending to the voice in your head? Are you taking those thoughts seriously, or can you shift that attention over to something else? And nothingness is a wonderful thing to focus on, and yeah, I sort of lost track there for a second, but yeah, sometimes there's just nothing to say.
Yeah.
And you just and you
Very
kind of
true.
recognize it, and you dig it, like, look, there's not, and it would be a very interesting thing to see how many people have either metaphorically ventured off into the woods or literally have ventured off into the woods as a result of this current situation. And when they come back, what are we gonna do culturally? What about all the people who started meditating? And they come back, and again, what if it is a sort of collective transition into something more interesting, something deeper than the thinking mind, and we all come back, and we're kind of like, we come back from this, and maybe that's the purpose of situations like this. Shake the thinking mind up a little bit. Maybe we needed it. Shake the thinking mind up and find if there's anything else there. For so many people, that's the only thing that exists. But you go into the woods long enough, and you realize how trivial and small the thinking mind is, and you become, as you said, the observer. You start watching your thoughts, which is a great practice, especially for beginners. You start watching your thoughts, and you're like, how did I ever buy into that? How did I ever think that was me?
Yeah.
And that's can be very insightful, I think.
Yeah, another interesting way to think about it, I think, is when you look at a fast-moving train, it looks like a continuous kind of a thing, but once it slows down, you see the gap between the wagons, and that's exactly how this, at least to me, it happened. That your thoughts just one after another, you don't even think about that there is a gap. So if you slow down and find one gap, I think that pokes a hole into this illusion that, hey, what you feel and what you think about, you have to react to it immediately, whether emotionally or physically or verbally, however it is.
Well, and you seem like a fellow guitarist. I see some guitars in the background.
Yes.
One of my favorite things when I'm playing guitar is you stop thinking. And you really embrace, like, I have no idea what's gonna. I don't even know how I'm doing this. I don't know how I'm doing it. And this and it all happens. And the less you think about it, the more you get in touch with the spontaneity, and the better it ends up being. And then the thinking mind comes back on. And says, oh, wait a minute, that was really good. And then it screws everything up. But you can notice those same gaps in the and sometimes it could be a little bit more intentional, because when you're playing an instrument, you're sitting down, and sometimes it takes a while to get that gap. And then all of a sudden the gap can get to be pretty. There's sometimes I've sat down and, I didn't even notice a half an hour went by. And it was just so blissful. I'm like, wow, half an hour. I haven't had one thinking thought the whole time, And so music has a certain way. And it, again, intellectuals, like, why would music is such. I did a project for my class. I said, it was a Friday project, and all they had to do was say what music means to me. And it blew me away. I mean, sometimes students will write down a couple sentences. They're trying to get by, and like, okay, I'll do this assignment. But, and man, that was one of the best overall assignments I've ever given students. When I said, what does music mean to me? People went on pages and pages and describing how, and it's like, from an intellectual perspective, that's very interesting, because music doesn't do anything. These aren't professional musicians that are making money So if it doesn't make money, it doesn't make us a better like, why are you doing it? Well, the wonderful thing about music is it gives us it's a purposeful gap in the thinking mind. And and so you start realize, I mean, one possibility I'm kind of exploring this in the book I'm working on, is that we don't think as much as we think, which puts another kind of thing into the thinking. Like when you're it's like the refrigerator problem, you open the door and it seems like the light's always on. And so we think we have a thinking problem because, like right now, if you start putting the thinking mind on the table, it feels like I'm thinking all the time. And really, we're not. And in fact, those gaps you're talking about happen a lot. We just don't notice the gaps.
Yeah.
We're so identified with the parts of the train, we're not even noticing the gaps. They're there. And we can work on noticing them. And the more we notice them, the more we realize how small the train is and how so much of it is gaps. And I think that's one of the fundamental reasons why music is so important to people. It's that vacation from the thinking mind that so many people need. And so I tell a lot of people, get an instrument. If you're sitting around and you're plagued by your thoughts and you can't seem to find a way out of the thinking mind, because the more you try to get out of it, the more deep you get into it, pick up an instrument and start messing around. That's a great way to get those gaps to become more obvious.
Yeah. Well, music for me, I always think of it looking back, especially I'm writing my memoir now, and I have to relive a whole bunch of stuff that was not comfortable living in the first time around. But it's really interesting going through them now with, this perspective of like, interesting that those things happen. I couldn't have planned any of them. Same thing with music. Like music found me. I didn't find music. It was inevitable. And the point, I think, is, well, music is one medium, but it's all about the artwork and creative process that is built upon, again, nothingness. That you become this conduit rather than a critical thinker through whom ideas flow. Alex Gray talked about that as being visionary artists, that you experience the light of the divine, you become a conduit through whom this light is projected and reflected through your work. And when done correctly in that context, your audience will have the similar kind of an experience. And
yeah,
I read his book like a year and a half ago, The Mission of Art, a few days after I did my first ayahuasca ceremony. And it was just mind-blowing. I fell in love with music all over again because of like, this is the objective. This is the purpose, not objective, but the purpose of, and I had those experiences that, I'm gone. I am not here. I don't know what's going on. I don't know where these things are coming from. And the moment I try to make sense out of them, they're gone. Which suggests to me nobody who's done anything of similar kind of substance that resonate with people, they wouldn't know how they did it and they wouldn't be able to replicate it themselves.
And and when you start with music, then you start realizing how true that is for so much of what we do.
Yeah.
So when I wrote the book, I'm like, I have no idea where that stuff came from. It's like it just falls out of nothingness. I don't really, and then you can kind of tell, like there's stuff that my ego sort of creates, and that's always crap. And I'm like, okay, just throw that all out.
Yeah.
And there's the other good stuff that comes from nothing, and you're like, you keep that stuff because that's the stuff that people connect with.
Yeah.
You can tell whether I'm faking it, and if I'm purposely trying to be clever. And you're reading a book, and you can tell when that person was trying to be clever versus when it came from a really interesting place. And so it's probably around any source. I mean, maybe even like accounting. Maybe there's certain clever things that happen in accounting that come from the nothingness. I don't know, but I think music is probably a good place to start, and then kind of expand that experience into the other parts of your life.
Absolutely. Hey, we mentioned a number of names. I think it's also valuable to mention the name Ikkyo. Are you familiar with Ikkyo?
Nothing's, coming to mind.
So Ikkyo, it's actually really interesting in my life because I grew up watching Ikkyu Sun, which is an animation about this child Zen monk who's very witty and very intelligent, always play tricks on emperors and all that. And this is on Iranian television, dubbed in Farsi. Fast forward to 2011, I came across a traveling Zen monk at a very specific point of my life who was practicing Zen alongside with psychedelics. And he got kicked out of the monastery when he was a teenager exactly because of that, because he had an experiment with a psychedelic mushroom. And he went and told his Roshi about it. I'm like, what are you talking about? You don't belong here. And I was like, oh, we had a children program named Ikkyu Sun. His name was Ikkyu also, the Zen master that I came across. And he said that he was named after Ikkyu, who is a Zen figure and a folk hero of Japan. And this is a man who he was a bastard of some really wealthy or well-connected individual in Japan. So he was given to a Zen monastery. And he grew up in there, and they gave him eventually certification of enlightenment. And upon reception, he tore it apart. Like, this is nonsense. Yeah. And he left the monastery, and he became the person who was a poet, and he would drink and go to brothels. And a lot of his poetry is about prostitutes and how he feels about them. And his whole perspective was that sexual desire is a desire that you have. Trying to defeat it is defeating what is. And again, like exactly what we're talking about. And there are so very few of these figures throughout history that, to me at least, is like what really is valuable is being found in this realm in a very rare kind of a quantity. So I thought it would be interesting to also mention Ikkyu. I'll send you some links to some of his poetry. It's a very interesting figure.
Well, that's people who seem to be able, that's a Zen master trip, to embrace the natural flow of reality.
Yeah.
And we all, are just so amazed when we see someone who just, you can't get them to be nervous. You can't get them to be embarrassed. You can't get them to regret anything that happens. And that gets very frustrating for, normal people, because they kind of this that perfect flow. And, yeah. And then, that there's an old Zen saying about the snake, some snake bit someone and they're like, well, aren't you mad? He's like, no, it's the nature of the snake to bite. Why would I be mad at them? And it's the nature of us to have sexual impulses, to have aggressive impulses. And we get hung up on this. And we're like, oh, well, I was really angry the other day. So, oh, well, that means that I'm not very spiritually developed. Really? I didn't know that. It's just that, Zen masters get frustrated like anyone else. The only thing is they don't get hung up on being frustrated. And they have sexual, the whole flow of that kind of nature. Are we trying to control it, or do you just let it happen? And it sounds like, like so many Zen masters, they were just really good at just letting it happen. And there's just not that many places in our culture for people who see, even though there's not many places, they're still such a mystery to us, and we know there's something very unique and special about them. And they can just I think comedians are kind of a way in this sense, especially the comedian who would do live stuff, and they just flow and they come up with something, and it looks like someone in the audience is slamming, and they just turn it around perfectly. And we're all just kind of like, wow, how'd you do that without thinking about it? Mm-hmm. It just, it was that perfect kind of flow of, whatever happens, whatever the world throws, I'm just going to go with it. And then it gets very harmonious and poetry-like. And that seems to be the trip of the Zen master. Of course, the problem is, we're not going to be able to think our way into it. And what they've learned and discovered, is that kind of, so much of the Zen literature is anti-intellectual, and so actually Alan Watts told a really interesting story of, going into koan and he thought he'd be very clever, and he kind of took a frog and put it under his kimono. And so when he asked, well, what's your true nature? And he's going to pull the frog out. And the teacher just looked at him and says, too intellectual, you know. You thought about it too much, and you can't plan to be spontaneous,
Yeah.
you know. And that's the problem, you know. The Zen, they become one with nature, and because of that, they're genuinely spontaneous. The rest of us are too busy planning on what we're going to do to even enjoy what's happening. And we're too busy being clever or trying to be clever or come up with that next, you know, it's like in a conversation, you're not really listening to the person. You're really thinking of your next clever statement, you know, and so you miss out on what's happening. And in missing out on what's happening, you're missing out on reality. So how can you flow with it if you're not even attending to it? And so, yeah, I'd be interested in getting into some of that poetry.
Yeah, for sure. I love it. I started reading them, and then poetry started coming to me. Like, you know, again, I don't think about them. They come to me. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer, and I write them down maybe within a minute or two, and that's it. I move on to something else. But he definitely has been in such an interesting way, from that children program to the Zen master I met. Very interesting figure. And I think it's also interesting to mention that just because somebody started doing Zen, that doesn't mean that they become, you know, so-called enlightened, because there are a lot of them who get very occupied with the institution and how they look and the respect they should get and all of that. Again, Ikkyu left the apparatus of Zen establishment back then in Japan for the exact same thing. That like none of this matters.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole nature of things becoming formal and creating a bureaucracy. You know, there's nothing bureaucratic about Zen, but for some reason, people can't help making it into a bureaucracy. You know, what are the 10 principles of Zen? I mean, how could you not laugh at such a thing? It's like, look, are you really going to try to force it into 10 principles? And, you know, I remember another story. I think it was Suzuki, who was giving a speech out at Berkeley, and he was trying to give like 5 concepts, or maybe it was the Eightfold Path, some very basic Buddhist principle. And he's like, I can't remember any of this. He goes, just look it up. And that's, yeah, so, you know, but that's, you know, he went with it. You know, he couldn't remember it. And instead of fighting it and being frustrated and tensing up, and, you know, he just, you know, hey, I forgot it. I don't know, you know, and yeah.
That's awesome. I love it. I hope I'll have you back. My goal is to have 100 episodes of this podcast by the end of the year. I hope I can get you back maybe in a couple of months to review the world. Who knows what's going to happen? I love these kind of conversations.
Yeah, it's really enjoyable. And like you said, I mean, right now we don't know. And so we have to wait to the end of the movie, and it'll be fun to get back together and kind of say, hey, wow, we didn't see that happening.
Yeah.
No one could have predicted that one. Yeah. And yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah.
Awesome. Chris, where can our audience follow your work?
Most of the stuff I've been doing probably on my YouTube channel, just Chris Niebar, PhD. And I make a video a couple times a week and just explore different things. And I have a Facebook, just No Self. I think if you look up Facebook, No Self, No Problem, it should come up. And I usually do post and just about the same stuff we were talking about, different kind of self, consciousness, and all these kinds of things. But probably Facebook and YouTube are probably my main things, and Twitter a little bit, but not as much. And yeah, and you know, I'm hoping to get something out. My next book is going to be something about not thinking about consciousness, and hopefully that'll be out probably, well, next summer probably, but that's something I've been busy with this summer and probably fall. We'll see where that goes, but I'll keep you up to date.
Yeah.
Hopefully it come out soon.
Yeah, awesome. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, which the question itself has become meaningless for me throughout this process. When I came up with it, I was so happy. I'm like, this is a fucking great question. But right now, I'm like, why am I even asking this? But I'll continue asking it. That if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
I think if I ran into an alien and I had to explain humanity, I would say, please forgive us for our thinking mind. We didn't mean it. The thinking mind had the best intentions, and it's true. It paved the road to hell, but it was really just doing it. It had the best intentions. So forgive us for the thinking mind and all the messes that we got into thinking our way out of the messes. Um, I think the best thing humanity has got going for us is that ordinary people have experiences beyond the ordinary. You know, you can have these conversations, and sometimes you can find people like, you would never expect. They seem so by the book, and they seem like they followed all the. And then but to get them in the right context, and they'll tell you about some bizarre experience they've had that went beyond the normal, and shows you that they know this thing we're talking about. They know the nothingness. They know the void. They know the connection between nothingness and somethingness, and they sort of get it. And I think I would convince the alien, look, we've got hope, and we've seen beyond. We may be possessed by the thinking mind, but we've also seen beyond it, and enough of us have. And we know that beyond the thinking mind, there's a certain connection that we all have. And so if we can just make it through without, blowing the planet up, if we could just make it long enough without destroying ourselves, we're going to come up with something really pretty cool. That would be my plea to the alien.